Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our live Q&A, where we'll be answering your questions about the race to find a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Pat Winokur, who is an infectious disease specialist, executive dean of the Carver College of Medicine, and she is currently leading the University of Iowa's participation in a clinical trial to study one of the possible COVID-19 vaccines. Please submit any questions or concerns you have now, and we'll answer as many as we can throughout our discussion. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Winokur.
Thank you.
Let's start with the basics. So there's no vaccine for COVID-19 that has been approved and available yet, but lots of researchers around the globe are working towards that goal. Could you give us an overview of the vaccines being studied and what's happening here at the University of Iowa?
Yeah, so I think the last time we spoke, which was probably about a month ago, there were about 5 or 6 vaccines that were in late stage testing, and that number has gone up to 11 now. So you're seeing really rapid changes in the numbers of vaccines that are entering into some of the bigger clinical trials to study their efficacy. And the results are interesting. So we're starting to see the publications of the first individuals entered into these trials. It looks good. The blood studies look like they're developing antibodies, but also we're starting to get a sense of the safety of the vaccines. And most of you do know there are a couple vaccines that have been put on hold. And that's a good thing because it says that we're doing the right thing as we're watching safety carefully. The study we're doing here at the University of Iowa is the Pfizer vaccine study. This is a messenger RNA vaccine. And so far, I think this study is the one that's in the lead. They've enrolled about 37,000 people around the world, and about 70% of them have gotten their second dose. So we're getting a lot of data. And as you've probably heard, the company has set points when they stop the data collection. They don't stop it, but they analyze the data and decide whether the vaccine has shown enough protection from COVID-19 to get FDA approval for use. And they're in the stage now of doing one of their data cuts, so we can all keep our fingers crossed.
Absolutely, fingers and toes. Could you tell us about the results of the vaccine trials that you've seen so far, including with our participants here at Iowa?
Yeah, so I'm blinded. So if you remember, the study design for almost all of these studies is half the people get the active vaccine and half the people get saline, or what we call a placebo, salt water. And we have been blinded to what our subjects get. But I can tell you that we are seeing some reactions. Sore arm is very common with this vaccine, and that's also true with the published data. We've seen some people that have felt fatigued, a little flu-like, which is not uncommon with many vaccines. I would say the numbers of people with those reactions are a little higher than some vaccines, but also in keeping with other vaccines that we have studied and we have FDA approved, like Shingrix with the shingles vaccine. So nothing so far that has been worrisome enough to stop the Pfizer trial. And there's another trial, Moderna, which is also a messenger RNA vaccine. It's the second in line right now. They've enrolled, I think, 27,000 people. And they too, I think, have been seeing that same sore arm, feverishness, but nothing that stopped that trial either. So these are promising results.
Yeah, so it kind of reminds me of the flu shot, where sometimes with your flu vaccine, your arm can be sore. Sometimes you can feel kind of icky, but you're not sick, and it goes away pretty quickly. It sounds similar to that.
Yeah, so what we've seen is that usually, I would say this is a little bit more what I call reactogenic than what I've seen with flu vaccines. So the sore arm is a little more intense, and the feeling flu-like is a little more intense than I've seen with the flu vaccine. but Tylenol and ibuprofen work like a charm, and most people feel really back to normal within 24 hours.
Yeah, that's good to know. So you've mentioned that there's several studies going on right now. You just mentioned two of the largest. Is it possible that we could have more than one vaccine available to us at some point?
I actually think we're going to have several vaccines that will get approved. And that's a good thing, because eventually we'll have the ability to compare them and see if one is better than the other in creating antibodies or protecting for a longer period of time. There are other studies that are getting ready to roll out. They will be very different vaccine platforms that are actually much more traditional and much more like how we make vaccines for flu. So the Novavax study is getting very close to starting around the country. And this is a vaccine that they purify the spike protein, add a compound to it to kind of rev up the immune system a little bit. And that's very similar to vaccines that we've had approved for many years.
Great. So you already mentioned safety at some point earlier in the discussion, but we can't emphasize enough that we see that as a concern for a lot of people. Recent polls are showing that Americans are very worried about the safety of this vaccine. So how will researchers and our government measure whether a vaccine is safe and effective? And how confident are you that it will be safe and effective?
So safety is measured in every step of every trial. And remember, with all of these trials, we start with a very small number of people that are enrolled, and we follow them, almost every 2-3 days. We follow laboratory studies, we follow their symptoms, we have them write down diaries of whether they had a temperature. And it's only after we've proven safety in that small number of people that we start moving into these larger numbers. But even as we get into these large numbers of people, 37,000 people, we are very carefully following all the symptoms that they're experiencing. Did they have to go to the emergency room or their doctor? Those are the things that help us understand whether these vaccines are in fact safe. And we're very carefully documenting any change in health. Even if it's something they had before, but it's gotten worse, we write that down. And so we get these very extensive lists of illnesses that develop in our subjects. Most of them are probably just run-of-the-mill things. You went out to eat, you have an upset stomach, that type of thing. But we do occasionally get events that are more serious. Someone had to go to the emergency room or develop something that looks more concerning. And those will then get worked up very carefully to understand if there's another underlying illness that did just happen to occur during that same time point. Or maybe it's something that we think is associated with a vaccine. And that's certainly what happened with the Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine. They had one person that they thought developed a new neurologic symptom. They, in that case, thought that perhaps they actually had underlying multiple sclerosis that was undiagnosed at the time of entry. But then a second person developed an illness that was consistent with transverse myelitis. The US chose to put a very significant pause on that trial. It's interesting, Europe didn't. They paused, they reviewed those two incidents, and they were willing to continue to follow. The US tends to be a little bit more rigorous in our drug approvals. And the fact that we have continued that pause, I think, shows you that we're pretty attuned to watching for safety.
Yeah, so there's a lot of Americans who are concerned about taking it, I think, because maybe they don't understand the rigorousness, which I appreciate you explaining to us. Maybe you could give them some peace of mind. when a vaccine is approved, would you get it, Dr. Winokur?
I absolutely would. But I think there are a couple of reasons why I would. Sure, I would love to protect myself. That would be something that I would expect this vaccine to do, and that's certainly what we're going to be proving. But I also think it's really important because I am around patients who are at high risk. And if I can prevent them from getting COVID-19, that's really important. I also have an elderly parent. I need to protect my mother, others in the community. And so there's a humanitarian reason for taking the vaccine too, and I take that responsibility very seriously.
Well, I know you don't have a crystal ball to be able to tell the future, but it's a question everyone wants to know. Will the COVID vaccine be, or when will the COVID vaccine be approved and available?
So that is the crystal ball question of the day. I would say, so FDA, the other thing that's important to know about safety is FDA actually even increased their safety requirements and their follow-up for these studies in October. And I think it was in response to a lot of the concerns that people have. And because of that, I think it's going to take just a little bit longer time to get to the endpoints that the companies need to achieve before they can have the data for the FDA to review. I would say November, December would be when they will get the data to FDA, and they will scrutinize it carefully. And there will be independent scientists that will scrutinize this data very carefully. And that will only be after that very intense review that they will think about approving it.
Well, thank you for giving us a little bit of that insight. Again, I know you can't tell the future, but we always like to ask our experts when they think we might have that light at the end of the tunnel. If you're just joining us, we're here with Dr. Pat Winokur, infectious disease specialist here at UI Healthcare, talking about the search for a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine. Please leave any comments or concerns or questions in our comments below, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. So for many Americans, the speed of vaccine development this year can feel kind of dizzying, especially if they don't know how trials work or the many steps that go into a trial. Could you explain why we've been able to work on this so quickly?
So, one of the things that we've had going for the past decade is a lot of interest in developing these more novel platforms for vaccines that allow us to create them faster. A lot of the thanks goes to the fact that we're using cancer vaccines as a very promising therapy for helping control metastatic spread of cancer. And because there's been so much work over the past decade on creating these platforms of vaccines, we've been able to get the right proteins into these vaccine platforms to get them tested. And there were a lot of tests that have been done in humans for these platforms to show that they're safe. The other thing that's really helpful is the work that some of our scientists here on campus did with SARS and MERS. They were starting to understand what proteins in these viruses that are very similar to the coronavirus that is now spreading the globe in 2020. And they found the most important proteins that stimulated an immune response. And because of that work, we were able to pick the right proteins and put them into these vaccine platforms. So a lot of the thanks goes to some very attentive scientists that have been working diligently for many, many years.
Yeah, so that's great insight. And I think it's also important to note that this is kind of what happens when we have a global pandemic, right? The whole world is searching for this vaccine, or the researchers throughout the world. So it's not just a handful of researchers doing this work. It's really kind of all hands on deck right now, right?
so that's absolutely true. And a pandemic is a different kind of worldview of science. And we know here on campus, all around the country and the world, scientists have put aside their other research to really try and understand SARS coronavirus 2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, and understand the immune responses and other things that are causing some of the serious illness. And so that's been exciting. And it is why we're pushing the vaccine development so quickly. A pandemic is a special time. We have a need to get this vaccine out so people can start getting back to their normal lives, which I think most people would like to do sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Really quick, I was hoping you could maybe give our viewers an insight into what actually is in the vaccine that we're studying here at the university.
So this is the vaccine. It's called a messenger RNA vaccine. And so what it is, it's really kind of the process that our body uses naturally to make proteins. If you remember your molecular biology, which many of you probably have tried to forget, our genes have DNA. Our body then takes bits of that DNA and creates what we call messenger RNA. And then your body takes that and turns it into proteins. And those are the proteins that make up cells and all the components of the body. So they started, they skipped the DNA step, created the messenger RNA step, and then they depend on your body to create the protein. And so all we have to do is get that messenger RNA into the cell, and then the cell goes about its business to create its own proteins and display those proteins the way it naturally would in an infection.
Thanks for that. That's a helpful explanation of what's in the vaccine and how it will work. So we have a question from Facebook. This is from Danielle, and she asks, will this be a one-time vaccination? Do we know that yet?
We absolutely do not. So it's not going to be a one-time vaccination for one reason. Most of the vaccines that are being studied now require 2 doses. And most of them are 3 to 4 weeks apart. So to get fully protected, you need to get 2 doses of the vaccine. But we do not know how long these vaccines will last. From the studies that we can see in the literature, the good news is the vaccines are stimulating an antibody response that's actually better than what we're seeing in people who recover from coronavirus. It's about 3-4 times better. So that's actually helpful. I know a lot of people are worried that they see, well, you know, now they're showing these people that are getting coronavirus twice, you know, maybe 5 months apart. Because we're creating a more intense immune response, the hope is that the vaccines may actually be better than natural infections at preventing second infections. But my guess is they're not going to be good for the rest of your life. I think that you probably will need to get a second dose, you know, in a year, 2 years, something like that.
So is that just another reason why herd immunity won't be possible with COVID-19 until we have a vaccination? Is because, you know, getting it from a friend or family may not be as effective as the vaccine?
Well, I think it's really a combination. As one, really, when you've looked at the numbers of people that have actually contracted COVID-19 so far, in most areas, it's less than 10% of the population. So there's a long ways to go from 10% of the population to probably what we need, which is about 60-70% of the population to have antibodies. So you need something that gets you a lot more people covered. And I think the vaccine is safer than getting coronavirus.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
And that's another important thing to think about when you're thinking about safety, because the vaccine obviously has to be safer than the disease itself. Otherwise, it's not a good vaccine. And I think with how many people have gotten devastatingly ill from coronavirus, we have a lot of opportunity to protect people in a much safer way than allowing just continued spread of coronavirus.
Absolutely. So at least one of the vaccine trials, I believe it's the Pfizer trial, has expanded the number of participants and it is now including children. What's the reasoning for this?
Well, so the expansion had a couple reasons. One is they added HIV patients. So this was, if you're thinking about giving a vaccine that might be in some countries that have very, very high rates of HIV, that's important. They included 16 and 17-year-olds first, and that was because we're starting to know that we need to cover children as well. And just recently, they added 12 to 15-year-olds. So that's starting to get the vaccine studied in children so that we have the data to know that it will be safe. And remember, we always test all of our drugs in adults first and prove safety before we think about moving it into children. And so they've got really good safety data now for 37,000 people, and now they can start to move into children. And so that was one of the reasons they had the opportunity then, by increasing the numbers, to also get more numbers of people that are at risk of coronavirus that they can follow for their endpoints.
So is that a good peace of mind for people who are wondering about that safety piece of this, that we've actually added children to this study? So that means we've shown it's safe enough in adults to start testing on children.
Exactly. I think we would not have expanded if we didn't have a really good safety database now.
Oh, that makes me feel a lot better. And I was already pretty confident in it. So once the vaccine is approved, who decides who will be eligible to receive the vaccine first? And do we think younger and healthier people might have to wait while other more vulnerable populations get the vaccine?
Yeah, there are several groups that have been working on these strategies. In the United States, we have a group that helps create kind of our immunization policies. It's called ACIP. But also the National Academy of Medicine, which is a group of very talented scientists, have also weighed in on what they think is the best way, but also the most ethical way of distributing this scarce resource. And if you look, the first group that they are going to cover are essential workers. That'll include those that are in the emergency room, paramedics, fire. Those individuals are out in the community a lot, or they're in a healthcare setting where they're really critical for taking care of the COVID-19 patients. They will also expand into some of the essential workers that are running some of our city services that we need. The elderly will be one of the next groups, just because this is a group that has a high risk of serious illness. And we do have a lot of data now that's being published in the 65 and older population, and they too are generating a very good antibody response to these vaccines. And then as you go down, it will be expanded to more of the general population and the healthy population.
Right. So with the vaccines looking very promising and people confident that we'll have a vaccine really soon, there are some people who have decided to ease up on safety precautions we've been talking about for the past 7 months, like masks and social distancing, hand hygiene, thinking that the vaccine, will be here and will be a cure-all for all of our problems. Could you explain what's at stake over the next few months and why taking safety precautions is still so important?
Well, so I don't think we're going to have the vaccine for a month, 2 months right now, even approved. So there's a few months, we're starting to get into winter. It's a time when we're going to see more illness, and we're already seeing it in Iowa and around the country. But remember, once that vaccine is approved, we aren't going to have enough doses to really spread around to all populations. And you're going to perhaps protect the hospital workers and the paramedics and the fire department. But that's only a very small sliver of the population, and there's still a lot of opportunity to transmit coronaviruses from person to person. A lot of people don't think we're going to have really large quantities of vaccine until late spring to early summer. And so we have to go ahead and continue to practice the best prevention that we can, which is masks and hand washing and social distancing. It's imperative, and this is going to be really hard to do over the holidays, but it's really important. We just can't keep spreading this person to person. It's harming too many people.
Thank you for that really important reminder. And you actually touched on what's coming up soon, which is flu season. And so I just want to ask for our audience, with both of these viruses circulating this year, is it more important than ever to get the flu vaccine?
It is more important than ever to get the flu vaccine. So there are a couple reasons. One, we know that people can get dual infections. So there will be people that could get coronavirus and influenza. That's going to be devastating. And both of them are life-threatening diseases. You add them on top, it's going to be devastating. But the other reason is, remember, a lot of the testing that we do uses the same reagents that we need to use to test for coronavirus. We may run out of the testing materials. We may run out of masks. All the things that we do to protect people from spreading the disease in the hospital. We may run out of hospital beds. We're already getting to a point where we're very worried about hospital beds again. And we're seeing in states that were doing fine a few months ago, they're at a critical stage now. And if we can do anything to try and reduce that burden on the hospital, that's going to be really important.
Yeah. So just to reiterate some of the things that we really want our audience to be remembering, get your flu shot as soon as possible. Continue to wear masks, good hand hygiene, social distance when we can, avoiding closed spaces, right? So, as the weather gets colder, we're all going to need to keep that top of mind that enclosed spaces are really not a great place to be with others, right?
That's unfortunately the case. And I know people are getting tired of social distancing. They want to go out and see their friends, but now's the time to be even more diligent.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those reminders and for all the other valuable information you provided through this discussion. I want to just give you a chance to leave our audience with anything else about the vaccine research or just anything you'd want them to know and keep top of mind.
Yeah, I think that people just need to trust the science and the process of watching the safety, because this is not going to be compromised in this vaccine. The scientists are going to keep going and watching all the things that we need to watch and ensure that these vaccines are as safe as they can be. We will continue to learn more once these vaccines are approved and out in the general public. Like any other drug that we have, sometimes we will see things later when you get it into millions of people. The FDA is not going to rest on the data that they got with 30,000 people. Every day after that, they're going to be watching for new safety events. And if something needs to stop, we'll stop.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us today, Dr. Winokur.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you tuned in after we began, make sure to go back to the beginning of this broadcast to hear all of the great information Dr. Winokur provided us about the COVID-19 vaccine. Stay tuned to our social media accounts and our website, uihc.org, for all the latest updates on COVID-19, the vaccine testing taking place here at UI Healthcare, and tips for staying safe as we move forward with the year. Lastly, please remember to wash your hands often with soap and water or use hand sanitizer, wear a face mask, and keep a safe distance from others when in public. And also make sure to take care of your physical and mental health. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, everybody.